Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, and I'm here in Riyadh with a number of people, and we're expecting about 50 members of the ADS association to be joining this webinar this morning, which, as you all know, is an update from the Magic Kingdom on what has been going on in aerospace, defence and security over the last few months. It's actually been just over a year since we last did our ADS webinar, and those of you that have been following what has been going on in the kingdom will know that an awful lot has changed in the last 12 months. And of course, that builds on the change that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. Just to start with some housekeeping, to just make sure everyone can hear us okay. There will be questions at the end of the time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a panel that will enable you to type questions that you may have, and we'll then address those at the end of the webinar. We'll also be providing contact details for the team at the embassy and the team here at AEI at the end of the presentation for you to get in touch directly should you have any additional questions or require any additional advice and guidance about how to do business in the kingdom. So this is going to hopefully be about half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Just to introduce everybody, my name is Stuart D'Souza. I'm the CEO of AEI, Arabian Enterprise Incubators. We're the partner to the UK Department for International Trade to provide market entry advice and guidance to British exporters looking at the Saudi market. I'm joined here in Riyadh by Paul Hancock and Lizzie Daniel from the Defence and Security Organisation who are based here at the embassy in Riyadh. And I'm also joined by Heather and Yazan from the AEI team. The agenda for this morning, we're going to go through just a very quick general update on life in Saudi Arabia, and then we're going to get into the detail of defence, security and aerospace, what's going on, the current landscape, a few of the personnel changes, and then a deeper look at transformation and the procurement cycle that we're currently in. And although things are slow, things are also starting to move. So hopefully that will be of interest to everybody. And then we'll finish up with the outlook for the rest of the year and going into 2020. At that point, I'll also just mention briefly about DSEI and the embassy's plans for DSEI, as well as the Saudi, the likely Saudi attendees at DSEI in September. So, as I said, please feel free to ask questions through the panel on the right-hand side, and we'll then address them at the end of the session. I just wanted to start with a very general update of a few things that have been going on outside of defence. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen there a few pictures of some of the events that we've had in Kingdom. The top right-hand corner is the skydivers over the Neom site. The picture of a Saudi female runner taking part in the marathon there on the left-hand side, being beamed onto the Kingdom Tower. We had the Formula E race in Riyadh in December last year, and the first race of the Formula E for the next 10 years will be held in Riyadh. And then a couple of other pictures on the bottom right-hand corner is the design for one of the flagship hotels of the Red Sea project. So there's no way I would have been saying any of these things probably even just 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago in Saudi. So the cultural impact of Vision 2030 is really starting to grip the kingdom. And it's not just cinemas and major events, it's things like bands, music bands in bars, well, not bars, music bands in restaurants, street parties, more public entertainment, more things to do, more life. And that's a real real change, and those of you who visited the Kingdom recently will see evidence of that left, right and centre. We're also now starting to see a bit more meat on the bones in terms of the mega projects. Most of the projects in terms of NEOM, the Red Sea project, Qiddiya, the CDC project, which is a massive housing project, they've all now got teams, entities have been created, teams have been formed, CEOs and boards have been appointed, processes and policies are now in place. So although, again, it's been a fairly slow start, the scale of the task is so massive that it has taken them a bit of time to get themselves organized and to get the right people in place and the right processes behind them. But things are moving. So NEOM have now awarded their PMC contract, their program management contract to AECOM, and the first camps and sites are being started up in the north of the Kingdom. There's now a functioning airstrip up there. So there's a real commencement, if you like, of that program. And the other mega projects are all different levels of maturity, not only in terms of delivery, but also in terms of design and concept. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around what many of these mega projects will look like. But what is encouraging is that there is money, there's funding has been allocated, there are teams on the government side, and there are now contractors being appointed. So there are opportunities and people are winning business. Just economically, very briefly, obviously the Kingdom's fortunes still are very much tied to the oil price. And the increase in the oil price in the last 12 months and sort of a stabilization between about $67 and $70 a barrel is obviously very good news for the Kingdom. There's been a 48% increase in government revenue year on year for the first quarter of 2019. Of course, a lot of that comes from the increased oil price, but actually non-oil revenue also rose by 46% year on year, with the new taxes, VAT, and the removal of subsidy generating significant revenues. In Q1, 41 billion reals was raised from sales taxes, from VAT and sin taxes. That was double what they raised in Q1 in 2018. So the coffers are looking reasonably healthy. Of course, there are a number of threats and systemic issues. They're still going to run a deficit this year of about 6 or 7%. But the measures that they've taken are beginning to bear fruit. Of course, there is also the constant challenge of managing government expenditure. And there is an area for concern here. Government expenditure has increased by 8% year on year, but most of that increase is in the salary bill for civil servants. That now stands at about 122 billion reals. So it's a huge percentage of the overall spend for government. Other challenges that lie ahead: unemployment. MBS has set some very challenging targets for the reduction of unemployment. It's still hovering around the 12.5% mark. And although there is undoubtedly a greater number of Saudi nationals in employment than ever before, the way that they are recording unemployed Saudis and the way that they're metricated has changed. And so they're not necessarily seeing the increases in employment reflected in the unemployment numbers. But nevertheless, it's at 12.5%. That's down from 12.7% in October last year. So a small decrease. Some of the actual decrease is offset by the change in the way that they record unemployment. But broadly speaking, moving in the right direction. A couple of other challenges. Vision 2030 is certainly gripping the cities, but there is still considerable concern about the regions and the more rural towns and cities that are outside of Riyadh, Jeddah, and Khobar, in the Eastern Province. And we expect to see a greater emphasis on making sure rural and provincial parts of the kingdom keep up with the Vision 2030 treatment. Of course, as the mega projects, particularly NEOM and the Red Sea project, start to move, that will really benefit rural areas over in the west of the kingdom. But there's still a lot of effort to apply to the south of the kingdom and, of course, the northeast as well. Foreign direct investment still is a major challenge for the kingdom. It's been in a fairly constant decline for the last decade, and not helped with issues in October last year and other bad news this year. But the opportunities for FDI are only really now beginning to emerge in terms of public-private partnerships, in terms of a better understanding for foreign investors of the regulations, rules, recourse that may be available to them that would create a more favorable investment environment. So again, it's a key metric for the Saudi government is to try to get more foreign investment into the kingdom. They've not been that successful thus far, but we'll see towards the end of 2019 and into 2020, some of the changes they've made so far this year, we'll see the impact of that towards the end of the year. Of course, we have to mention some of the regional issues. Yemen continues to be a major challenge, and broader regional geopolitical issues with Iran and the Cold War, if you like, between the kingdom and Iran continues to be a major source of uncertainty. And from a business perspective, of course, uncertainty is a major risk. So everyone will be keeping a close eye on what is going on. Any escalation in those issues would obviously be extremely negative. But there was a promulgation yesterday from the Royal Court on the basis from a cabinet meeting saying that the kingdom will take all steps necessary to avoid war, which is a fairly obvious thing to say, but it's nonetheless good news. So moving into the defense and security landscape, I appreciate most of you will know the kingdom reasonably well, but it's worth just running through the various disparate entities that exist in the kingdom currently. And they are still very much siloed and stovepiped and disparate, but there is a plan as part of the broader transformation that there will be more joined up thinking, more joined up procurement, more joined up training, more joined up maintenance, repair, overhaul type work across all branches of the defense and security landscape. In terms of the Ministry of Defense, so as you know, the Ministry of Defense is concerned with defense of the realm and expeditionary warfare, very much akin to the UK MOD, and comprises the Royal Saudi Land Forces, the Air Force, the Naval Forces, and the Air Defense Forces. There is a plan that there will be a bit of a shake-up of this organization, and a long-awaited amalgamation of the Air Force and the Air Defense Force is still on the cards, but has not happened yet. And there's also some talk of a space component being added to the Saudi MOD. In terms of changes, well, the chap on the left-hand side, top left, well, on the top right-hand side, but the left-hand photograph is the new Deputy Minister. This is Khaled bin Sultan, His Royal Highness Prince Khaled bin Sultan, known as KBS. He is MBS's younger brother, full younger brother, and he was previously the ambassador in Washington. He was appointed last month, I think it was April, but it had long been a long-standing plan that he would come back from Washington and would take up the post as Deputy MOD. In terms of his actual remit, Still not 100% clear, but he's certainly sitting over the transformation, over the reorganization, the repurposing of many of the government departments, so many of the departments within the Ministry of Defence. So he's hands-on from a transformation perspective, but less involved in the actual operational side of the various branches. On to the National Guard. There has been a lot of change in the National Guard, and broadly speaking, it's been very positive. We have a new minister who was appointed in the new year, Prince Abdullah bin Banda, and Prince Abdullah had previously been the deputy, one of the deputy governors in the Western region, but had apparently been waiting for 3 months to take over this role. So it wasn't a knee-jerk decision, it was a long-standing decision. And what's interesting is, obviously, you can see from the photographs that both KBS and Prince Abdullah are both young thrusters, so they're both part of the MBS peer group and have been tasked with delivering the Vision 2030 treatment to the MOD and the National Guard. And I put a comment in there about the future looks brighter now for the National Guard, because it wasn't that long ago that we were talking about the potential for a greatly slimmed down National Guard capability. There is still the chance that they will lose some of their capability. We know that the land forces are looking at their aviation, in particular the Black Hawk and Apache fleets, but it's not clear yet, and we wait to see the outcome of the transformation. But what is clear is that there's going to be a much more joined up approach from a back office perspective, from a support perspective. So although the fleets might operationally be independent in terms of Black Hawk and Apache, there will be eventually, I'm not saying it will happen this year or maybe even next year, but eventually there will be a much closer alignment in terms of spares and repairs, training, and that sort of thing. The Ministry of Interior, not much has changed there since we last spoke, but of course there were a number of changes in 2017. Prince Abdulaziz remains the minister, again a young thruster from the same sort of peer group, age group as MBS and KBS and Prince Abdullah. As you will all know, this time of year, the Ministry of Interior is on its countdown to Hajj. So where the MOI and the National Guard will both deploy in total around 300,000 security personnel to Mecca in readiness for the 3 million pilgrims that will come through Mecca in the sort of 10-day period of the Hajj. Last year, or maybe, sorry, 2017, when there were the big changes at the Ministry of Interior, the counter-terror forces were taken out of the MOI and put into a new organization called the Presidency for State Security. And this broadly comprises what was the MOI Special Forces, the Special Emergency Forces, Special Security Forces, and the General Security Aviation Command as well. They remain commanded by General Harani, who is seen as one of the leading counter-terror professionals in the kingdom. And instead of being lost in the mega ministry of Interior, they now report directly to the king. The Royal Guard are obviously still a very active force, and they have an extremely challenging job in terms of protecting members of the royal family. They get a particular mention here because they are still receiving the 900 light armored vehicles, the 8x8s that were ordered towards the end of 2014 from General Dynamics Land Systems in Canada. Originally about 900 ordered, is now down to about 725. those are still destined for the Royal Guard, and this will be a substantial increase in the capability of the Royal Guard. And currently, the Royal Guard sits outside of any other ministry. It's very difficult to know, obviously, what is going on with the Royal Guard in particular, but we are expecting that they will be impacted by the transformation as well. In terms of other agencies, it's worth just mentioning too that have a particular UK presence, if you like. So the National Cyber Security Authority, that should actually be NCSA, not NSCA, but the National Cyber Security Authority, again, relatively new body, reinvigorated early last year with a new minister, and there is a British company that is effectively the prime contractor for the National Cyber Security Authority currently, and we understand there are extensions to existing contracts, but going into 2020, we're expecting the new minister to grip the cybersecurity sector, and there will be some changes to the way in which they are structured and how they deliver their programs. Another UK sweet spot at the moment is the National Risk Unit, where MBS has decided to adopt the UK model for civil contingencies and COBRA, the sort of emergency cabinet level response team. And there are, again, a number of British companies involved in establishing that National Risk Unit and the Disaster Management Centre, which, again, hugely positive for the UK in terms of UK influence, but also reflective of the maturing nature of the kingdom's desire to be able to respond to any incident in the kingdom, whether it's a natural disaster or some other threat. So, just some specifics on the defence sector. Those of you that were on the webinar, or indeed have tuned into any of our other webinars, will recognise my drawing of the new patronage tree, as we call it here in the kingdom, which is supposed to show how the Public Investment Fund and Vision 2030 effectively will become a route to market for the Saudi government to buy goods and services, to manage projects, and to deliver Vision 2030 into the Saudi and international supply chain. It's worth having that in the back of your mind, that the whole kingdom is receiving the treatment, and there's a lot of uncertainty around how it's all going to be delivered. There's a huge emphasis at the moment on consultancy, on getting advice and guidance and getting ready for transformational activities to take effect. And there are different levels of maturity, all the different branches, and of course this picture is just illustrative, so that's not all the branches. There are probably dozens of branches off the Public Investment Fund. There are different levels of maturity, and each one you could spend a day or two just talking about. In defence in particular, the most mature part undoubtedly is the MOD Transformation Management Office. So Dr. Samir Hidayat, who runs the Transformation Management Office, known as the TMO, has been in post for about 2 years, and things are slow. They are struggling with the scale of the task. They are struggling with sourcing people from within the ministry to be champions for transformation in the rest of the Ministry of Defence, and they're struggling with some of the consulting companies that they've appointed. I think all of them would say it's fair to say that this is a gargantuan task, and they are facing some real challenges. So They are reaching out to governments around the world, the US, the UK, and France, as well as the Chinese, for some professional support to try to accelerate the transformation. And we're waiting to see how those ideas and plans to accelerate move forward. At the moment, things are not stalled, but they are slow. So we expect, of course, it's Ramadan, of course, it's the summer, but even so, it's still quite slow. And we expect things to pick up in Q3, Q4. The transformation process is expected to go to the Ministry of the National Guard and the Ministry of Interior as well. The National Guard have formed a transformation committee, and that does also comprise not only National Guard senior officers, but also representatives from the UK and the US. And they have a very broad remit to look at the whole of the National Guard, and in concert with Dr. Samir, look at how things can be transformed. And of course, transformation in a Saudi context really means better value for money, absolutely, but also more industrialization, more local content. So those sort of twin themes, if you like, are what drives a lot of the transformation activity. We've also seen quite a lot of activity from the Public Investment Fund. So the Public Investment Fund, essentially a sovereign wealth fund, or the sovereign wealth fund in the kingdom, a number of acquisitions overseas, not in the defense space, so in Uber and Tesla and whatever, but also interestingly in the defense space. It's a public domain information that the Public Investment Fund are in talks with Denel to acquire their munitions and ammunition business in South Africa. There are rumblings that might actually be expanded to include some of the land systems business as well, but very interesting to see how Saudi is going on the acquisition path overseas with a view to bringing capability back to the kingdom. And of course, this is all about developing and sustaining sovereign capability in the kingdom. And there's been a lot of talk about acquisitions of Saudi companies that have foreign ownership, that have capability in Saudi. And we know that there are ongoing discussions between the Public Investment Fund and the owners of Advanced Electronics Company over its potential acquisition. It's not quite been concluded yet, but it gives you an idea of the appetite of the PIF to acquire local companies. And this is reflective of something of a nationalization strategy for key or critical indigenous defense capability. So they are looking at buying up a number of existing Saudi companies, but also they have, of course, established a number of new companies to operate in the defense sector. And what we've been saying for a while is that we will expect a consolidation of these entities because many of them have competing capabilities. There's a crossover between many of the defense and security aerospace companies, and that process has now started. So Tatnia, who some of you may have heard of, is a public investment fund company. They've actually closed five of their seven businesses. So Tatnia Aeronautics, for example, is gone. Tatnia Defense and Security Technologies is gone. Tatnia Advanced Materials is also gone. What's left, Tatnia Space, which does a lot of on-aircraft comms, internet on Saudi flights, that sort of thing, that's going to the new Saudi Space Agency. And Tatnia Holdings, which is where the secure military satellite program sits, that's staying under Tatnia for the moment. This consolidation is going to affect other companies as well. So there'll be more to see in this space going forward. With SAMI, obviously everyone's talking about SAMI, but the reality is SAMI still has no capability to do anything. There's still discussions and still some uncertainty as to whether or not SAMI is going to be a holding company for shareholdings in existing or new businesses, or SAMI is actually going to be a prime contractor with 40,000 employees and factories and facilities and warehouses. I suspect that debate will be overtaken by events pretty quickly if some of the big procurements that are planned by the end of the year take place. Then SAMI will find itself more in the prime contractor box than being a simple holding company. But there's still great uncertainty around its actual function, but there is no doubt that SAMI is going to be the principal beneficiary of industrialization activities for major programs in the kingdom. And lastly, GAMI, again, everyone talks about SAMI and GAMI almost synonymously. Of course, they're very, very different entities. GAMI is very much the regulatory body that will oversee defense industrialization and defense procurement, not just the Ministry of Defense. So this is one of those areas that is a real change from previous years, where GAMI will have a pan defense, aerospace and security sector remit to look for volume procurements that could justify industrialization, to look for value for money, and of course what we've been talking about, or what many commentators have been talking about, is the offset regulations. These have been drafted and they're currently with one of the consulting companies for review, but there's no indication yet as to when they're actually going to be published. They were supposed to go out, be issued before Ramadan last year, then it was going to be after the summer, then it was going to be the new year, then it was going to be Ramadan again, but still, here we are a year later and they're still not published. And the reason is, I think, my view is because they're still waiting for a number of the public investment fund companies to be at a sufficient level of maturity so that when somebody is awarded a contract and there is an offset obligation, they can go straight to a public investment fund company to service that offset obligation. There is also the ongoing debate between the prime contractors who take a very, obviously, there's the ongoing debate between prime contractors and the Saudi government around the difference between offset and industrialization. Those discussions are ongoing and are largely being led by SAMI, but SAMI is taking a very hard line in terms of that their expectation is that foreign companies will invest in the kingdom and then the orders will come. Whereas, of course, the prime contractors are quite rightly saying, no, give us the orders and then we will industrialize. So a fairly sort of quick canter through what's been going on in the defense and security sector. In terms of procurement, well, there has been quite a lot going on. We are emerging from a couple of years of fairly quiet procurement activity across the sector. Of course, there have been some headline grabbing projects, for example, Patriot, and we've seen in support of Yemen lots of orders for bombs, bullets, and body armor, the usual sort of urgent operational requirements and that sort of thing. But there has been money being spent, some government to government, some G to G, and some DCS, some direct commercial sales. You might have been following the Littoral Combat Ship project, LCS. The Saudis have chosen the Lockheed Martin vessel, and in 2017, a design contract was awarded, $22 million. In 2018, a long lead time item contract was awarded for $450 million. As FMS programs, they have to be fully funded. So these are substantial commitments. Obviously, the long lead time item contract in particular, substantial funding coming from the Royal Saudi Navy for the FMS acquisition of 4 littoral combat ships. Lots of discussion, uncertainty around where are they going to go, what is the program for shore facilities and training, where on earth are the crews going to come from, how are they going to deploy these vessels, what's the CONOPS, etc., etc. Those of you who have done business in Saudi before will know that those are always the questions that people ask, and they are often not answered. But currently LCS is moving. On SANCOM, on the Saudi National Guard Communications Program, which is a UK to KSA government-to-government program, we've seen the first signature of a new letter of agreement between the 2 governments, and a new prime contractor has been appointed, replacing Airbus Defence, to take over the operations, maintenance and training contract. This is a huge step forward for the SANCOM program, and a very positive step to continue the relationship between the UK and the Kingdom when it comes to communications for the Guard. There's a tender, I think it's now just beyond its submission date, but it's been out for the last few weeks, for roll equipment for the M-ATV fleet. You'll recall that the last, pretty much the last deliveries of the 1,500 M-ATVs that were ordered by the land forces from Oshkosh were delivered last year, and there's now a requirement for some additional roll equipment. And interestingly, there are 2 British companies that are actually named in that tender as directed procurement. So a great success for them. And the roll equipment is jammers and comms kit and armor and anti-mine rollers and that sort of thing. And we're also seeing a couple of major programs that have been on the back burner for a while that are now moving into a trial phase. So there is an 8x8 trial for the Royal Saudi Land Forces. It's currently scheduled for the end of August, going into the first week of September. It's very interesting because this is the first one where we're seeing SAMI's involvement right from the start, and the Land Forces Committee includes a number of SAMI personnel, and SAMI have pretty much prescribed which vehicles will come to the Kingdom. This is not going to be government to government, this will be a direct commercial sale. And SAMI have said there's a minimum target of 50% of local content. And they've been very clear, don't bother coming if you can't meet that target. So it's very interesting to see the dynamics between the land forces and SAMI, but it's also asking a lot of questions about, well, what does that actually mean, 50% local content? And again, people don't necessarily have the detail because the offset regulations haven't been published, so they don't quite know how it's going to work in terms of local procurements versus overseas imports and that sort of thing. In terms of the vehicles, there's lots of the usual suspects. There's still some debate as to whether or not General Dynamics will put their 8x8 in. Of course, GD have about, well, just shy of 2,000 8x8s already in Saudi in service with the National Guard and the Royal Guard. But because of the political issues, it's not certain whether or not they will attend the trial. Obviously, there's no UK offering in the 8x8 sector. There's not going to be a vehicle coming from Germany. And that sort of lends itself more to either a South African vehicle being successful or an outside chance for someone like the Singaporeans or South Korea. but it's all going to come down to the level of industrialization. There's also the potential, and this is probably more interesting for UK companies, for a 4x4 trial. We know some companies have been invited, and we're trying to get a slightly wider list of companies to be invited, but they will face a very similar stringent industrialization expectation. There's a tender out currently for the C-130 upgrade program. Again, long awaited. The first phase is, I think, 16 aircraft, all to be done in, as you would expect, all to be done in Kingdom. And we know of a number of local companies that are bidding. Again, in the aerospace sector, it's largely the usual suspects. So we'll be talking about Al Salam and AEC and GDC and some of the primes, Northrop and of course Lockheed. I think the last thing to say on this slide, and I've just got one more to go after this, which is the impact of some of the changes to the rules around the use of agents and partners. There was a very clear view last year from the Ministry of Defence that they did not want to deal with agents anymore. Having said that, the MATV roll equipment tender was issued to 5 local companies. So, and when I say local companies, I mean proper Saudi businesses, not foreign prime contractors that have established here. And it's still not entirely clear what the distinction is, but it seems to be that where there is the opportunity for local work share or a systems integration or procurement integration task, they will go to a local company. If it's simply buying kit, then they will go directly to the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, rather than going through an agent. So that doesn't mean necessarily that you still don't need partners here on the ground. Of course you do. It just means they probably won't sit between you and the customer. And of course, in most cases, that's a huge positive. It helps to reduce payment issues, helps to reduce reputational, ethical issues. And of course, that latter point is important to the transformation as they try to clean things up quite considerably. Right, the last slide, and then we'll go into Q&A in a few minutes. I just wanted to give an update on the outlook, if you like. The picture on the top right hand side is, you'll recall, from MBS's visit to Washington when Donald Trump brought out his boards with his shopping list of what MBS was going to buy. The Saudis have not actually bought much off that list. Patria went through, the F-15 program had already been signed, but the helicopter deal that was one of the most likely ones has not happened. And we now understand that SAMI have approached an alternative supplier to potentially provide a significant helicopter order with local assembly. Other major programs, the tracked vehicle programs, so Bradley, M109, M88, M1. Again, it's unclear what is going to happen. If they carry on as being FMS programs, it is likely that there will be limited industrialization, and President Trump will get his way of sustaining jobs in America. It does feel that some of these programs are now being put into the too difficult box, where they cannot resolve the political desire to have both jobs in the Kingdom and in the US. And I've been told that the follow-on order for Bradley, so yeah, there was Bradley upgrade, and there was also a Bradley new buy of maybe 500 vehicles. Those 500 vehicles may now be converted to wheeled vehicles and will be serviced through the 8x8 requirement. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. On the fast jet side, of course, we're still waiting for Batch 2 Typhoon to be signed, and there remain very substantial problems with German export controls. But everyone is hopeful. In broad terms, the budgets have all been signed off, the procurement's all been signed off, but now we have this issue with the Germans that will hopefully be resolved as quickly as possible. Other programs, command and control, big training program for the Ministry of Interior, long planned, but no real movement as yet. So things are slow, but there are certainly things that are moving, and we're expecting Q3, Q4 to be busy, and 2020 has to be busy. They have to get moving now on some of these programs, not only from a capability perspective, but also from a political and credibility perspective. There is beginning to be a little bit of a few wobbles from a sort of corporate stamina perspective for some of the big primes who've been promised year after year after year that programs are coming, and they're not moving. So 2020 has to be a busy year. Of course, lastly, just to say the risks of doing business in Saudi Arabia, the most important thing you can do is to pick up the phone to the embassy and ask for advice and guidance about how to appoint an agent, how to structure your contract, how to do business in the kingdom, and try to, as much as possible, mitigate payment risk, reputational risk, as well as asking for the embassy's support in terms of understanding what UK export finance can offer for not only larger businesses, but also small, medium-sized businesses, for delayed payment insurance, financial support for providing performance bonds, and a whole range of other services that your first port of call for is the embassy team. So, if you have any questions, please do post those in the right-hand side. We've got a couple there now, which we'll just go through. So I've got a question from Tom Peterson. Which British company is the prime contractor for the National Cybersecurity Authority? I don't think I can tell you that, but it's a very large British telecommunications company, and they've been in the kingdom for a number of years. They are very, very likely to retain a significant work share going forward, but it will be under a slightly different structure. So the new minister, his name is Iban, he has a plan to change the way in which they've structured their cybersecurity model, to try and bring in critical national infrastructure, the Ministry of Interior, as well as some of the other government bodies, the IT, Communications and IT Commission, bringing them all together from a cybersecurity perspective. Another question from Rob Laidler. Do you see a coming together of the SAMI invest and you will get orders, and the business make orders and we will invest approaches to industrial localization in the kingdom? Well, I think that the prime contractors will hold their line, which is that Saudi Arabia is not necessarily a place to invest speculatively in terms of the sizes of the volumes of investment that are required. I'm aware that one company told SAMI that if you take this approach of invest and the orders will come, well, you're pitching Saudi Arabia in the same field as South Korea or Taiwan or Singapore in terms of bringing supply chain to the kingdom. And yet to import anything into the kingdom is very, very difficult. The labor market is extremely difficult. The tax program, the tax system for foreign companies is extremely onerous. Saudi will never win if it's competing against other places as a place to invest for capability. If it's on the back of an order, then absolutely people are very supportive of industrialization. And I think that the prime contractors are holding their line long enough that the orders will come anyway. As we see, I think the 8x8 order, the plan for the 8x8 program is that they are requesting technical proposals by the end of July, commercial proposals by the end of August, albeit quite indicative, rough order of magnitude pricing. But they'll then down select maybe only 2 or 3 companies to take it forward to an actual tender stage. And they're talking that, from what we currently understand, that they will be expecting to place the 8x8 order by the middle of next year. Now, even with there's no way that anyone is going to invest in capability in establishing an 8x8 factory between now and the middle of next year. So that one will be overtaken by events. At the moment, the prime contractors are all holding that line, and I just don't see any of them breaking that at the moment. Any other questions? So, question in about who are the bidders for the 8x8 tender? How can we learn from Saudi Arabian resources? In terms of the bidders, it's obviously not public domain, but we do know, broadly speaking, who the runners and riders are. A lot of the usual suspects. There are a couple of vehicles coming from South Africa, a couple from the UAE, one from South Korea, one from Singapore. I think what will be interesting, if you find these things interesting, will be if the Chinese and the Russians turn up. So Norinco from China there's been a sort of an invite. A number of the formal invites were only issued yesterday. But if Norinco sent their vehicle, that will be interesting. When the King was in China last year, there was a broad defense MOU signed, which was principally around joint exercises and that sort of thing, but it did have a defense procurement and industrialization component. And we know that they have bought defense equipment from the Chinese previously. They've bought UAVs most recently, but prior to that, they have bought armored vehicles from China. So the Chinese and then the Russians. There are a couple of Russian contenders, one of which is a joint venture with Renault from France. So it could potentially fly a couple of flags, either the French flag or the Russian flag. But again, it'll be very interesting to see, given the political dimension, the political dynamics between the kingdom and Russia, as to whether or not there'll be a Russian vehicle in the trial. A question in from Jonathan Clegg about the MOI training opportunity. So this is, again, something we've been tracking for a while. Those of you that have been involved in the kingdom for some time will know that up till the end of, or mid-2017, there was a very substantial training program that was administered through a public investment fund company called Elm. They appointed Raytheon as a prime contractor for a very broad training package comprising about 38 different sort of work packages, covering skillet arms, covert entry, all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but all principally focused on the special forces, the MOI special forces. Of course, since then, the MOI special forces have now been broken out into the Presidency for State Security, and the PSS are keen to get this training program back up and running. There are a few issues. Raytheon will tell you themselves that there was a very challenging program, and that whether or not they would bid again is uncertain. It's also not clear whether or not the PSS would have the route to market for the PSS would be Elm again, or would they go direct? But it's certainly on their agenda. Having said that, there's no tender out at the moment. There's not one on the shelf ready to go, and there's no budget for this year. Of course, nothing's ever black and white in Saudi, and because I've said that now, probably next week they'll issue a tender, but it's highly unlikely there'll be anything this year. But if that's an area that's of interest to you, then please get in touch, and we can talk about how we might be able to support you more closely. So that's it. I think we're coming to the end of the hour. I'd just like to thank Brynley at the ADS for supporting this webinar and for allowing us to talk to his members today. Any of you who are interested in coming to Saudi Arabia, please do get in touch. We can provide visas and hosted market visits and a broad range of support. I just want to say one last thing about DSEI. There will be a significant presence, obviously, from the DSO team. Both Lizzie and Paul will be there. AEI will also be there. We've been asked for the fourth DSEI running to be a keynote speaker, and we'll be talking about defence transformation in the Gulf. And if you are interested to meet us there, please do get in touch. There are always a number of delegations that come from the Kingdom, generally led by the Royal Saudi Land Forces, but there's also a naval contingent, a team from the National Guard, and sometimes, but not always, the Border Guard, which sits under the Ministry of Interior. So it's generally a good show for the Saudis to attend, and it's after IDEX is their sort of favourite show, if you like, to attend, probably because it's in London, but also because it has such a broad representation of companies and capabilities. So I'd like to leave it there. Thank you everyone for dialing in. The webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the AEI YouTube channel shortly after this, after we conclude. So thank you very much.